All right. Welcome, everybody. I know Shantae is going to be a little late joining us, and I'm sure our other three colleagues will be here as well. Again, I really do appreciate the fact that you guys are here on time. As I was saying earlier, that is a trait that most people in education do value, particularly when they are looking for leadership. So, all right, just a quick little kind of poll here. How many of you like the Fowler book? Anybody? It's not the best. Really? Okay, Annie. I have found the book to be informative, but I have found it to be the hardest thing to read because it is so dry and so boring. But realistically, if you get beyond this, when you can get beyond this book, it's got some good information in it. But I promise you that you will absolutely love the Essex book when we start using that one. And that again is one that you're going to put on your shelf and you're going to want to reference for those legal situations that come up. You will enjoy the Essex book, I believe, if you like anything to do with the law and those. But Fowler's a little hard read, but it is packed with information. All right, so I'm going to do my icebreaker when we get a few more people in here. So let me go ahead and go back to Blackboard and do a quick little review of Blackboard. I know you all are very comfortable with your Blackboard shell. I'm going to go to 708. There's a couple of things I want to mention in 708. And I'm going to go down, first of all, to the session tonight, session 2, our Zoom session. And I'm going to remind you, if you got some text readings, you're reading the Fowler book. You also have some questions from Fowler, questions 1 and 3. And again, I want to remind you, I don't have any really hard, fast dates except that April 29th. But I noticed a lot of you are putting stuff into the Grade Center. Continue to do that because I don't want you to fall behind. You will find that there's a lot of stuff that you have to do in this course. A lot of material that you have to respond to. Some things you can have some fun with some of those scenarios. But there's a lot to do, so please don't fall behind on it. But I want to remind you that of the chapter assignments. Hopefully several of you will join us tonight. So we'll have the chapter assignments. Tonight, we're supposed to have Mrs. Bates. We're going to have Shantae, but she's running a little late, so we may have hers out of order. Ms. Courtney is supposed to be here to do hers, chapter 3. Annie's got chapter 4, I hope. Daryl's got chapter 5, and Josh has chapter 6. And then next time we meet, which will right be before Valentine's Day, we'll finish all but one chapter of the Fowler book. So those are kind of our assignments. And so tonight, we really are going to be focusing on chapter 2 through 6 of the Fowler book, which will take us halfway through the book about policy and the origination of policy and the influencers of policy. I hope as you're reading the Fowler book, you've also kind of making some connections to some of the things we did at our first face-to-face session where you had a chance to talk about influencers and about the origination of policy. You also should have completed at this time your policy flowchart. If you have not completed that, start looking at that and go ahead and putting that in, because before we move away from our discussion of policy, I want to make sure you have a clear understanding of how your particular district handles policy. And from teaching this last semester, I know that districts do it differently. So put your flowchart together with a little verbiage explaining the steps, but it basically is just like a flowchart, showing me the origination of the policy all the way down to when it is finally adopted by the Board of Education. Now that goes under the discussion board tab. If you're looking at that, here's where you put it, the final board. No, I'm sorry, that's not it. Nope, that goes under course assessments. I'm sorry. There is your policy origination flowchart. It's under course assessments. Remember, there are only two places you really are going to have a lot of stuff to put things under: discussion board and course assessment right here. So this is your flowchart, basically looking for, if you want to do the flowchart, and I prefer the flowchart rather than the paper, because I think it's a much better to have a visual of how policies are selected. So I would encourage you to do the flowchart. All right. So that's where that goes, and that really is something that needs to be put onto Grade Center right away. Looking at discussion board, just to make sure everybody's on board with where we are, that board policy that you developed when we were in Charlotte a couple of weeks ago, you should already be entering that. And I think most of you have, but if you have not entered your board policy, this is where it goes. and it'll go into Grade Center. I think I've graded about 7 of those, which means three people or haven't turned that in yet, and it's really easy to put it in there. Your scenarios are here on discussion board. I've enjoyed reading the ones that have been turned into me so far. I just want to, and we'll have a quick little session on this next time we meet, and that is the duty to report. Because from reading a couple of the scenarios and your responses to them, what I'm seeing is that sometimes you're not being guided by state statute. And so we'll talk about the duty to report next time that we have our session. So if you want to go ahead and do some research on that, I think it's under week 4 and as we get going in the next week. So some of your scenarios probably need a couple of steps that aren't in there. All right, you also, now that we have chapter 3 that we should be responsible for, there's that question about Common Core. I have not seen anyone yet do their draft of policy A or policy B or policy C, or the draft of that part, and we'll talk a little bit more about that tonight as well. So, quick little reminder, everything that you need to do for a grade right now is going to be in discussion board or is going to be under the course assessment. Later on, when you turn it into Blackboard, we'll talk about using Turnitin. So those are the 2 places for discussion. Now, the last thing I want to show you, I believe it's down here. All right. This is the graded assignments, the points. Have you seen this? Have I shared this with you before? Okay. I forgot to put your draft policy, so now I have added that up. The original one that you saw did not have where you put your draft policy. You did the face-to-face session. So I had put it up there at the top. It was called to my attention that it wasn't there. I also corrected one other thing. I think I had one of your drafts in the wrong place, discussion board versus course assessment, so I have corrected that. Now, let me just call attention to some of this column here, the due dates. Again, I'm not stickler for due dates, but this is just to help you pace yourself so that you are not going to get behind. The real date, even though I have the May 1st, is the 29th of April, but I will take it up until May the 1st for the final parts of your policy analysis. It needs to be into TaskStream definitely by May the 1st. Now, I've got the point value, so you see how much everything is valued at. The only thing that has more value than other is that final analysis, and that's after you put everything together, parts A, B, and C. You've done your draft, you've got grades on those, you've cleaned them up, you turned in your finals. The final narrative is that one big paper that you turn in to me before it goes into TaskStream. So that one carries a 200-point value. This course is based on the 90. A is a 90%, B is an 80%, C is 70%. So you see sort of the breakdown of what you need in order to make an A. I do not give A pluses or A minuses or stuff like that. It's an A or B or C. So that's to look at that. I do want to call your attention, though. I did make that one little correction up here by adding that 100. There are the chapter assignments. So let me get out of this. All right. Is there any questions on Blackboard before we get started or the shell before we get started on tonight? All right, let's go to session tonight. Session 2, January the 30th. We're going to be moving along. Your textbook readings this week should be chapters 3, 4, and 6 from your Fowler book. You got it, and the answer to the questions from chapter 3. Here is the chapter assignments. I've already shared that. There's the graded due dates with the correction. We're going to talk tonight about, before we start your presentations from Fowler, we're going to talk about some of the demographic trends that are facing the nation. And I want to call your attention, and the reason why we're going to talk about demographics. And here is, you may want to write this down. Here's something I want you to do within the next week, is to try to put your hands on your district's strategic plan. Now, your district may call it something else. But what I'm really looking for, and I'll give you the name that we called it in Caldwell County, we called it the Western Piedmont Council of Governments Strategic Outlook. So what I'm really looking for is not the strategic plan. It's whatever you call it, but it is somewhere within the superintendent's office or someone in your district's office, there's someone who has done some research on how the district is changing. Where do we need to build schools? Where do we need to move things somewhere in your district? And it's really not the board's strategic plan, but it's the district's plan for how they're going to handle growth, when they'll close schools, and it may be called something differently. In Caldwell County, we called it the Western Piedmont Council Strategic Outlook. Do you understand what I'm asking for? Does anybody want a little clarity on that? Please ask now, because it's not your district strategic plan, because that belongs to the Board of Education. What it really is someone, and it's probably your auxiliary services. If you have someone who's in charge of buildings and books and those kinds of things, they probably have a report that's been done for your district that will project your growth over the next 10 years, that will project where you need new schools, that will project how many schools will be under-enrolled, how many schools will be over-enrolled. So that is what we use in the central office, particularly in the auxiliary services, to drive building new buildings, or where to add classrooms, or where to look for additional teachers. Within that report, there is probably a piece on the changing demographics of the county, or the changing demographics of the school system. Now, it is no surprise to any of you here tonight that the demographics in North Carolina are becoming, we're having a larger in South Carolina. We're having more and more Hispanic, Latino populations increase in our public school systems. That's probably a trend in every single one of the districts who are represented here. Somewhere within that report, someone in your district is housing a report that shows what the strategic plans are for handling those kinds of changes. So that's what we want to talk about tonight. Now, why is it important to you if you want to be a superintendent or an associate superintendent? It is very important, because if you don't know how your district is growing or not growing, and if you don't know where it is growing or where it is not growing, when you go into your first superintendency job, one of the things that you will probably need to do is to close a school if your school district is shrinking. Or if you go into a district that's growing, like Charlotte Meck, you're going to have to make decisions or help make decisions about where to put new schools. So knowing the demographic data and having that strategic report is critical. And that's why I want you to be able to get your hands on it. It is not private information. It may not be on your website because state law doesn't require it to be on your website. But someone in your district, and it's probably someone in auxiliary services, whoever handles the building program, that's probably where it is, and it is a public document, so you ought to be able to see it. But again, it's probably not on your web page, but it might be. Some places might have it on their web page. So before we start talking about Fowler, I want to spend a little time talking about that, because that's going to be the first thing that hits you when you become a superintendent, and it's going to hit you fast. So I have included, by the way, this is also information that will be useful to you when you start writing your dissertation, or when you start trying to put together research that shows anything about, if you do anything that's quantitative about a demographic change or how you're targeting a certain group in your study, you probably are going to need some census data. So this is a direct link to the United States Census Bureau, and it's got some awesome information. And I want to call your attention to it, and it is open, so you can go in. The Census Bureau, of course, will have a new census in 2020, but the Census Bureau has been responsible for updating the nation on how things are progressing. What's the big changes? And this top up here really is where you're going to be able to pull a lot of information for your dissertation, or when you start writing articles, or when you start doing research. So the Census Bureau has broken down the population, the economy, maps, products. That, of course, that's, you don't want that one. But then there's data, there's tools, there's surveys, there's newsrooms and all. This is a phenomenal source to bring out information, particularly with your dissertation. Or if you just, if you're just particularly interested, how are things changing in the state of North Carolina? So let's look at education. I pulled down the first category, topics. And under the field of education, you can find anything like school enrollment. And even though it goes, this is a 10-year statistic report, remember, you can actually go in and search for things. You can find a code. You can really pretty much find anything you want to in the Census Bureau. And by the way, the Census Bureau is an acceptable and well-used source for writing research. The United States Census has been, every time it's used, it's a safe source. It's not a Wikipedia. It's not one of those sources that is not readily acceptable. When someone cites the U.S. Census, it's a pretty good reference. So I would certainly encourage someplace in your report to have that. So you can look at almost anything. You can break down population by age and sex, families living together, family arrangements. And some of your topics may be, when you do your dissertation or your research, you may choose to do something about living with grandma. What impact does living with a grandma have on student learning? What impact does living with granddad or living with dad? So always an interesting place to go. And again, it's predictive. There's populations. But what I'm saying is this is the United States Census Bureau. Your district has something on a much smaller scale that should be projecting population growth and those kinds of things. There's all your databases, all publications, well-cited publications. It's going to be like if you're doing something about, your research is going to be about the learning styles of Hispanic students that may be different, or some of the different cultural learning styles that can be attributed to Hispanic students or ESL students. My God, you'd want to know all about the Hispanic population or whatever the Census Bureau says about it. Because a part of your dissertation, remember, that final chapter, chapter 5, is now that you've done the research, now that you've proven your theory, you've answered your research questions, now what? What's the purpose of your study? So chapter 5 really is kind of, here's what I've done, here's what needs to be done by someone else down the road. So it's a kind of a jump off point for the next person who's doing that research. All right, any questions on the United States Census Bureau? I'll put this here. This should be one of those go-to sites on your computer. Certainly something you'd want to mark and go back to ever so often. Any questions on it? Or, I mean, it's just great. I love it. I mean, you can pull down the library, or the little topics here, and you can see just about everything you would possibly want to see. If you're looking at voter registration, race, population estimates, income and poverty, that's one that everybody uses almost. Okay. Great site. Any questions? You guys are good. All right, so that said, let me share with you what's happening in North and South Carolina. So just kind of a general overview, because when you finish this Zoom session tonight, next week, you're going to be looking at the trend for your county. Now, where did I put that? Oh, I know what I'm doing. I was opening that. So this is available to you now once you refresh. And so let's look at it. I don't know if you've ever heard of Dr. James Johnson. Has anyone heard him speak? Dr. Johnson is a professor at UNC Chapel Hill, and he has probably spent most of his career looking at trends, and he is an educator by trade and an educator by heart. So he is really looking at the future of education in the country. He's called upon all the time. He's presented to school boards. He's presented to superintendents associations. I'm sure he's also presented to principals associations. But he did a report, and the most current one is the one in March of 2018, and it really is talking a lot about South Carolina, but is also talking about the United States. And his references to South Carolina are also references that can be made to the state of North Carolina. So I'm going to spend a little time on this, because you're going to, this coming week, look at your data for your particular district. And maybe we'll have a conversation the 13th when we get back. So in his presentation, and I don't know who this was to I don't know. But anyway, it was done about the demographic changes. He talks about the trends, the challenges. Oh, it must have been to a business group, because there's some enhancing competitiveness. Although you can think about that for the school system too, because we're becoming more competitive with charter schools and private schools and those kinds of things, and homeschooling. So here's what he says that's happening in now this may have been unique to the South Carolina audience, but it is North Carolina and it is the United States. it is probably not unique to your district. So that's why I kind of want you to look at that report to see if this is really true. All right, 6 trends that are going to affect education and your job in the next 10 years. The South will rise again, the browning of America, marrying, silver tsunami, end of men, and the cooling waters. Now, what does he mean by the South continues to rise? The main thing there is that the population of the South. So if you look at the population of the growth of the South from 2010 to 2016, and this is all of us in North and South Carolina, even though it is probably geared more toward the metropolitan areas. I mean, I would imagine Charlotte, but Kannapolis is close enough to Charlotte that you are probably a bedroom community now of Charlotte. Is that kind of a right statement? You're pretty much a bedroom now, aren't you? And Fort Mills in South Carolina, Columbia's got its own little bedroom communities. So you're not going to escape this unless you're in a very rural area of North Carolina or South Carolina. And I'm not sure any of us here are. So look at what the trends are happening. And this is the change in the population change, added 30 million between those 20 years. Population's going up by 14 million, and over half of them are going to be in the South. So the South is going to continue to have more population, which means we're going to have more and more people. The people that are losing is this great Midwest section of the country, this coal section up here, and all but California and some of these other little small these states here on the Mexican border. Those are all continuing to lose population, whereas those of us in the South are growing. Here you go. The Northeast is losing population. The Midwest is losing population, and only the South and the West are actually gaining populations. And look at who we are gaining in the South. 376, and this is a percentage. Growth of African American, Hispanic, 520% growth, 97% growth in our elderly, 145% growth in foreign born. Now, real quickly, someone answer me, what implication does this have for the public schools? This got several. Anybody want to hazard one? Let's look at this. Let's look at these two populations, Black and Hispanic. What implication does that have for schools in North and South Carolina?
Well, I think it would be, for one, just increased growth, and are you able to support and sustain the growth? But looking at Black and Hispanic, I think you know, Hispanic, you've got perhaps a second language involved. Are our teachers equipped to serve those families and knowledgeable about their culture? So I think it's numbers and politics and culture.
All right. Anybody else? Well, let's talk about a broader issue of competition. Now, if our schools are becoming browner and blacker, and we have communities, and you tell me how this is in your community, but I know in the community I came from, our charter school was all white. Our private schools are all white. So when it comes to the issue of how much support public, are we going to have more of that? Going to have less? I mean, what kind of, are we going to have more white flight? Are we going to have people moving away from cities because they don't want to be sitting there, don't want their children to be next to people who don't look like them? So that is a big policy issue. It's a policy issue that's driving private education, because I'm sorry, whether it's racist or not, private education is racist in most cases. I think private education has been, in the history, not all, but historically has been white flight as what's driven private education. So I think that's going to be a trend. You're correct when you talk about Hispanic populations. That's going to be the whole ESL issue of offering additional services. What about the trend of elderly? Hey, Courtney. All right, what about the trend of elderly?
Perhaps that impacts the workforce. That can have a negative impact on the workforce.
Yes, it does. It also may be these people don't have kids in school. How much are they going to be comfortable supporting a bond issue to raise their taxes so you can build new schools? Yeah, that's a problem too. So, but you see where they're coming. They're coming south as well as foreign-born. All right. The South has grown by 54%, higher than any other region of the nation. And then when you look at the states, although South Carolina is not listed on this one, it probably closely mirrors North Carolina, but you'll see where the big change is coming. Texas and Florida are picking up a lot of the elderly people, a lot of the Hispanic populations too. But you see right here, so South Carolina has got to be right here with us. 7.9% growth in population, as well as Virginia. So I'm going to skip over a couple of these things, but here's South Carolina statistics. The population in South Carolina has grown about 7.3% over the last 10 years. And in South Carolina, you see the big areas that are Charleston County. I guess that's the city of Charleston. Is that Charleston County for my South Carolina folks? That's growing. All right. I'm going to skip over a couple of these because it talks more about Charleston. All right, number 2. So the population change. The South will rise again. Basically, that the South is becoming a huge magnet for people coming here. All right, the second demographic that Dr. Johnson says is going to impact our public schools is the browning and the graying of America. What do you think he means by browning? Who are our browning population?
I thought that it was Hispanics and African Americans.
It's not African American, but it is Hispanic. That's what he means by browning. Not African American, but Hispanic. That's his definition of browning. The graying of America is, of course, the old part of us getting older, more and more older people. So he defines it differently. I would have thought browning would have also been African American, Hispanic, but he defines it as Hispanic. All right, so we are becoming browner, we are becoming grayer, and you can see basically from his foreign-born, the percentage of new folks being born in this country. Here it is, 45% of babies that are born are now being born to Hispanic populations. That has huge implications for our public schools, because that means these students will be coming to our doors. Now, probably a trend that you all have seen that has been going on with our public schools in our ESL populations. Do you see this, that more and more of your younger ESL students are coming in with some basic languages, English as a second language, some basic English skills? That's what we saw in Caldwell County before I left. It's a little bit better. It's not like it used to be. I think most of our Hispanic students who come now, half of them don't even qualify for ESL services. I mean, they speak that well, and that's because. Yeah.
I was going to share in Kannapolis. I believe it was October of this fiscal year. Historically, we've been a third Hispanic, African American, and Caucasian, and our Hispanic population is actually outnumbering the other two as of this year. I believe it's 35. So yeah, we're seeing a huge growth in that area.
All districts are. They really are. And this is what I meant about him. This is really him considering Hispanic as basically being the browning. You can see white alone, 81%, black only 8% growth, Asian at 21, which is another high percentage. When you look at the United States over those last 6 years in which he did this, when you look at the population change, you can see where these folks are. This is Hispanic and non-white and Hispanic. So this is everybody but white. You can see where the population is increasing in the South. South Carolina's not on here, and I can't believe he was talking to a South Carolina group. When he talks about the median age of the Hispanic populations, you'll see, or the median age, and here they are. You can see that our Hispanic populations tend to be younger. What does that really mean? What do younger people do more than older people do? They have babies. Those babies come to the public school. This is childbearing ages for the Hispanic women. So they tend to be younger, the two or more races as well. But you can see for the rest, the general age is going up a little higher than them. All right. Now, when you look at the births, you can see 2011 that 49% of the births in the country are to white parents, 15% African American, 26% Hispanic. How many of you are in a district where the Hispanic population outnumbers African American population? Anyone? Yeah, it's going to happen, and it's going to happen very quickly. In a lot of districts, I think if you asked this question 10 years ago, most districts, almost all in North Carolina, would say that whites are their primary population. After that, the largest minority population was African American. I think if you say that now, at least over 50% of the districts would say that African Americans are now the second largest minority populations in schools. And that's changing. And if at this particular rate, Hispanic populations will continue to grow, and at some point they will be the majority population. That has huge implications for public schools. It means that we're going to have to we're going to have to make sure that there's a language barrier, but the other is our classroom teachers and others are going to have to learn some of the culture of the Hispanic culture, because it is different. Just as we've all gone through, I hope all of you've gone through Ruby Payne's training. Everybody gone through Ruby Payne's training? Do you know what Ruby Payne's training is? Framework of Poverty. Oh, if you haven't read her books, you need to. She is, oh my God. If you can go to a Ruby Payne training, you really need to. Ruby Payne talks about her book, which is geared toward helping middle-class teachers, white teachers in particular, or everyone really, middle-class folks understand that some of the different cultures and styles of growing up poor, such as, and her purpose in her book is to write it so that we as middle-class teachers can be a better responder to minority populations or to our poor population. It's really based on poverty. And in that book, she talks about, you know, if a child from the trailer park speaks a little louder to you and you think it's being rude and disrespectful, it's really not. It's just their culture. It tends to be a louder culture. So Ruby Payne does a lot of explaining. So if you have ever wanted to go through a program to talk about cultural sensitivity, you've got to do Ruby Payne. Did anybody else, Lenora, did you have Ruby Payne training? She's wonderful.
I've not had formal Ruby Payne training, meaning I've not been in her presence. However, we have had training at the district level about her work.
So it's really about sensitivity, you know, understanding that just because someone's a little loud, that doesn't mean they're being rude and disrespectful. That's just a part of their experience in life. And the reality is that most of us who are in the field of education are good old solid middle class now. We may not have grown up middle class, but we are solid middle class now, and we have adopted the middle class values. All right, now the grain of America. This is the how much older we're getting. The average life expectancy, look at this, is good news for us. But in 2010, it was 78. Now in 2030, it's going to be 101. My God, we're all going to be around in 2030. May not be walking, and the healthcare system may be extremely expensive for us, but the population is getting older. And as such, that means that we'll be living longer. There'll be a lot more demands on the healthcare system, but it also means that most of the population will no longer have kids in school. And again, that goes back to the question of, if I am an 80-year-old granddaddy and all my kids have gone through school, why on earth would I vote to raise my taxes 5 cents to build you a brand new school for those kids who don't even look like me anymore? So I think the whole issue of how we appeal to the broader community, and particularly to the elderly community, is going to be a big thing, because we're going to at some point have a lot of people in our schools who don't have kids in our schools. A lot of people in our schools who grandchildren have gone through it and they've stopped thinking about the public schools. And sometimes we are going to absolutely have to have their support. You can see how the population's changing. We are getting older here. By between 2000 and 2010, the vast majority of the nation is between 45 and 64, and you can see that these numbers are growing. We are getting grayer. All right. And guess where the elderly people are coming? To the south. We've got them. All right. I'm gonna skip over that. All right. Family life is changing. Ozzy and Harriet, you don't have to say that anymore. All right, let's talk about marriage. Well, and particularly as it relates to interracial marriage or intermarriage, which is interracial marriage, marrying someone of a different race or ethnicity. You can see that the statistics show that now in 2010, 14% of the marriages were between people of different races. So has that changed tremendously? How many of you remember, well, I do, because I'm older than all of you, but I remember when black and white didn't marry. And Lord knows you didn't marry outside of your race. And all the children who came to school in the Ozzy and Harriet scenario, they were clear. It was easy to identify them. They were white, they were black. That was pretty much it. But children are now going to be coming to you. How many of you have seen an increase in your multiracial category? Have you? Yeah. It's interesting, and now people identify 1, 2, or 3 different races. So multiracial is going to continue. And who do they marry? Hispanic and whites, 41%. This was in 2008. Black and white, 11%. Asian and white, 15%. Two that would be non-white. So you can see that look at this 41% here. That's a lot of kids who are coming through our doors. All right, another trend is the cooling waters from grandma's well. Basically, this means the number of kids who are living with grandmas or grandparents. And you can see the percent change more. The household types where there are no grandparents in the scene, 1.4% change. Both grandparents, 41%, or grandma, 9%, granddaddy, 28%. So what you're seeing is more and more people who are living with both grandparents, grandmother, or granddaddy only. That within itself brings complications to us in the school system as well. Grandma is sweet. I've ran into a lot of really, really sweet grandmas. But can they handle sometimes they can't handle some of the discipline or some of the issues that present themselves, and they are not equipped to handling young kids. There's a reason why there's a certain age in which people have children, and that is because it requires a lot of energy and a lot of time. So when grandparents and granddaddies raising children, sometimes when they present themselves to the school, great people, but they are probably not as equipped as a mom or dad. So the number of kids who are growing up in granddaddy and grandma only homes continues to rise. But that's been something that's been going on for the last probably 50 years, the rise of grandma and granddad. But granddads, did you see that? More and more granddads. That's something that's fairly new. Have any of you had any interactions where the granddad is the primary person who comes to school? Yeah, it's more and more of them. Then the last one he mentions is the end of men. And ladies, before you get too excited about this, basically what he's saying is that women are taking over in the workforce as well as in politics. And our last election that we had, you see more and more women breaking that glass ceiling. And that's going to be true for most jobs. What it means for you, I hope, is that the stigma that to be a superintendent, you have to be a male, or that males do it best, all those types of stigma are going to go away because women are now asserting themselves. So, Josh, here's the plight of men. Today, men are not the breadwinners that they used to be. The marketplace, particularly in the marketplace of work, that men are withdrawing from it. There's higher unemployment rates for men. Men are no longer considered the absolute must-be breadwinner, and also the wages of men have been going down. So this is a good thing, I guess, that women are catching up to men. And the college populations now have changed tremendously. And you can see now that in our colleges and universities, women outnumber men in every category except the professional. Those are nurses. Those are the professional experiences that you have to have a professional license, that's also teachers. So you can see that's even close. But as you can see, the degrees, doctoral, everything is going to be more, women are exerting themselves, which is a good thing. When you look at the UNC, this is particularly the UNC system, the North Carolina system. When you see the percentage of people that are enrolled, you'll see that in the UNC system and the master's programs or in the community college programs are historically black universities, or I'm not sure what MSIs or PWIs are, but you can see that the percentage of males continue to decline. University used to be just the males, it used to be the only males could go. And up until the last 10 years, it was still predominantly a male thing. Even in private institutions, junior colleges, these are their technical colleges. I guess this is where men are still going. 62% of them are present in those. Okay, let me see. Here's the opportunity, so we'll stop there. So going back to his trends, here are the 6 trends that are, and he calls them disruptive trends, and it's disruptive because these all have impacts on the public schools. So for us, they will be disruptive because it will be a challenge to the status quo or a challenge to the ways we've always done things. Now, when you look at your district's plan, you probably aren't going to have the statistics as well written out as this. But somewhere within that outreach or that long-range plan for your district, there definitely should be something about population. There should definitely be something about the browning of America. The population growth is the South rising again, or the movement of people from the rural to the urban centers. You probably won't have much about the end of men or the number of grandma's homes, but try to find as much as you can about the trends of the demographics of your particular county. All right, so that's kind of what I want you to look at next week. I would like to have a quick little discussion about it, how you found that report, how useful it was to you, and what applications you see for it when you become the superintendent or the associate superintendent, when you have to make decisions about closing schools. All right. Any questions? All right. Shantae is running late. I don't know if Daryl, he had a thing to do as well, but Courtney and Annie and Josh, you all here, so we're going to do your report. But I want to do one more thing in case we run out of time. And if we do, we'll just push back the reports because we're all going to finish by 8:30. I want to bring you, and I won't spend much time on this, but I want to bring you back to your policy audit and analysis. I want to make sure that you are working on this or have started. Your policy audit and analysis has 3 parts. We already unlocked part A and B. Your first part, you should already be on to this. Here's what you should have done so far. You should have identified a policy you want to work on. You should have probably had a conversation with someone at the central office. Hey, Mr. Superintendent, Ms. Superintendent, can I work on this one? What do you think? And they may say, no, I want you to work on this one. Super, I do what they tell you. So you identified a policy, at least had some outreach to someone. It doesn't have to be your superintendent if you're from Charlotte MEC. I doubt Dr. Wilcox is going to be available to have that 10-minute conversation with you, but someone. And look at your policy manual. We did that. Look at the policy manual, and if you find out what category, what number it is, and what particular area it's in, that means it's probably an assistant superintendent who's in charge of that particular topic. That would be my point of contact. Or it may be in a large district like Charlotte, you may have all sorts of layers of people to talk to. So you've selected your policy, you've had a conversation with the person downtown, and the third piece you should have is already putting together that team of 4 to 6 people, of which you are the chairman, and of which someone from the central office, it may not be that person you got permission from, but someone from the central office is a part of that committee. Now, as you are, once you pull that team together, you'll be asking these types of questions here: the history of the policy, who influenced it, if the policy was written in 1953, which I doubt, and hasn't been addressed, why did we need a policy like this in 1953? So you may have a little problem with the history, but try to get as much of it as you can, as well as who really was the leading influencer for this particular policy, how many times it's been amended, why, pros and cons, changes. And basically for this first paper, 5 to 6 pages, you're going to be answering these questions in this little box, these 6, 7 boxes here. And that's going to be the basis of how you write your paper. So type page or part A is basically going to be answering in paragraph form these 7 questions. All right, so don't let this get behind you because it very quickly could. So that's part A, and you're working on it, I know. Part B, which we have opened to you, and you should not be on part B yet, but if you are, good for you. But finish A first, and you'd want to turn in A so I can give you some guidance. But part B is when you report out on what the team did. You make recommendations. This is where you talk about, here's what I want to change about the policy and here's why. You get your team back together to talk about it. You fine tune it. You meet with the superintendent again to share your work, and then you write the paper. And in this particular part, part B, you really are going to spend a lot of time on the policies, weaknesses, and strengths, and the recommended changes and the rationale changes, or the rationale for the changes. The other piece you must do is to make sure that as you are looking at this new policy or this policy that you're going to modify, and it is not a new one, it's an existing policy, make sure that you can truly say, yes, it's still true to our mission, and yes, it's still true to the vision of the district. Because every decision you make in your district, you should be able to answer that question, oh yes, this is why we do it. It relates to our mission, and it relates to our vision. That's part A and B. Part C we'll unlock a little bit later. You'll like part C. It's basically reflections. Everything reflection. So if I were in your shoes, which I'm not, and I know you all have full-time jobs, and I'm stuck here at Gardner-Webb with a cushy job, I would recommend that you really start concentrating on choosing that policy if you haven't already, putting together your team, go get permission for it, and then start thinking about what you want to do next. A is what you need to be concentrating on. We opened up B because in your conversations with that team, they're going to jump immediately to the strengths and weaknesses. And so you start taking notes because you're going to need it in part B. All right. Any questions? This will be a lot of fun, I promise you. I'm so excited about reading them. I usually hear a lot of great things. And if you want to privately email me and say, Steve, is this kind of what you're thinking? Is this the policy that you're thinking about? Let me give you some examples of what we did last semester in 708. 2 people chose to do the policy on tobacco use and all because their policies had nothing about vaping. So they wanted to, because this was a middle school principal, she wanted to address that with their their board. It's a small district, but she wanted to add something in there about vaping and doing some research on vaping. So that was excellent. We also had someone who did an excellent report on hers was more of a school issue, but it was related to the weakness in a policy, and that was about parents on campus. So even though it was really geared toward her own school, she had to write it about a district policy because the district policy really didn't address how you deal with belligerent parents on campus. And so she wanted to have something in there because that gives her a lot more strength too. It is now a board policy. Another one talked about sexual predators on campus. Evidently in their district, there was a very weak policy about what to do. And again, you're identifying a weakness. So make it something that, you may have thought, my God, this is not a good policy. What can we do to fix it? Or it may be a problem you're having at your school that other people are having too. Or you may want to canvass your fellow colleagues and say, if I had to work on a policy, which one do you think needs working on in this district? The end product of this is, I want to see you be able to take this to the next level and present it to the superintendent, perhaps present it to the Board of Education, and have the change happen. All right. Oh, I need to get out of this one. All right. Shantae is not here yet, but she'll be joining us shortly. So Courtney, that means you're going to be up with chapter 2. Are you ready?
I have chapter 3.
I meant 3. I'm sorry.
Okay.
She has chapter 2. So what we'll do is we'll have Courtney's, and the format of this is Courtney's going to lead us through her PowerPoint or whatever, and she's going to ask us questions, I hope. Right, Courtney?
Yes,
We're going
sir.
to have opportunities for us to weigh in on it. And all right, so Courtney, if I stop sharing, you ought to be able to. Hey, Daryl, how'd your board meeting go?
Oh, it was a graduation, mid-year
Oh, that's right,
graduation.
graduation.
Went
Huh?
well.
All right. Courtney, where did I lose you?
No, I'm going to share my screen now.
Yes, you share.
Okay. Can you see it?
Yes, chapter 3.
Okay. So I had chapter 3, the economy and demographics, and a lot of what Dr. Stone already touched on kind of goes in the latter part of the presentation.
Stop me, Courtney.
It's okay. It's okay. I only have 10 minutes. I did find it an interesting read in the regard of it was kind of hard to follow. But the focus questions that the chapter gave was these 4 questions. What is the business cycle? How does the business cycle affect spending on education? According to the 2010 census, how is the U.S. population changing? We kind of discussed that. What are the implications of these demographic changes for education policy, which we kind of touched on as well. So I'm going to try to make sure I go through those parts of that. Just a few terms that I pulled out that I felt were terms that we needed to know from this chapter was policy environment. And that's basically just the environment in which this policy is written for, which is important when understanding why a policy was written or why it needs to be written for a particular environment. So that's more local based. Economic environment, so what are the economic conditions during the time a policy is put into place or being changed or removed, etc. And then a business cycle is basically just the structural feature of the economy and the fact that decisions are made based on businesses and the government as well. So I have a question for the class. Does anybody know who this is? If you read the chapter, you may have an idea.
No one?
Nobody?
Athena?
That is correct. It is Athena, and I put this here because the chapter kind of opened up talking about the mythical Greek goddess Zeus and how he had this crazy headache, and one day his head just bust open and Athena came out. It was basically trying to make an analogy of how that was just a random action that came into play, but policy is not random at all. Things don't just happen. It doesn't just come out of the sky and somebody just randomly decides to write a policy. And so it kind of opened up with that. So I just wanted to include that there. But like I said, policy is not random. It doesn't just come from anything. It's always from a response to some type of difficult scenario or situation that's going on in that particular setting. And people that write policy, people that are consistently involved in policy, especially at the central office level and board members, policy very rarely catches them off guard because if they're invested in that process, they pretty much follow the policy environment of what's going on within that district. And, you know, it doesn't really catch them off guard when something is getting ready to be changed or something is getting ready to come into play because they're paying attention.
Right, and that's a key for you is when you become a superintendent or the associate superintendent, there really should be no big surprises. You should be seeing these things on the horizon. So now in North Carolina, the General Assembly can throw some curveballs at us, but in general, as a leader, like Courtney says, you're going to have it on your radar, and it's going to be out there somewhere.
Right.
You mind if I interrupt occasionally, Courtney?
I don't mind at all.
All right.
The next bullet point was talking about how, you know, not just those that may be writing the policy and the board members, but school administrators as well need to be paying attention to the policy environment, the economic environment of their community, so that they also can make wise decisions when it comes down to writing policies and voting for things such as that. And the last part that I took out of the beginning was this knowledge helps school leaders to conceptualize the broad direction that education policy is going. So not only do we want to make sure that we're paying attention to the policy environment and economic environment of our district for like right now and for local and kind of right now issues that may come into play, but also for the future. And when we talk about demographics, that will kind of make a little bit more sense. So as a leader, when you understand policy environment, it kind of talks about how there was a stance where sometimes leaders don't feel like they need to be involved in policy or pay much attention to it. But when you're not as attuned to what's going on economically and, you know, in your policy environment, you waste a lot of time, you can waste a lot of money, and you can waste a lot of energy, maybe starting a new program or something that's not long-term is not going to be able to be sustained in your district because of the economic conditions. And it talked a lot about, you know, the financial state recessions and things like that. And so, you know, as school leaders and then district level leaders, we need to be sure that we're paying attention to those things, because we don't have time to waste. We don't have money to waste, because we rarely have money anyway, and we don't have energy to waste, because whenever we waste time, money, and energy, we are wasting children's lives in essence. And so we want to make sure that we are paying attention to those things. It did a very extensive explanation of our country's history as far as the economy, and it was very mundane.
Oh, yeah, kinda, yeah.
But I tried to do an overview of kind of the things that it hit on, and it was really long. But it talked about the early days and how we started off with small farms, slavery, and indentured servitude. That's kind of how we got our money. Then it moved into capitalism with the Industrial Revolution, and how capitalism came into play. And then once that was settled in, you know, problems began to rise because there were great gaps with the wealthy becoming more wealthy, but then poverty and slums and things having to be formed because the poor people were just kind of struggling. And then it talked about the New Deal, how policies were put into place to kind of combat capitalism, and the economy started to get better. And then it went back down again. There was a decrease in economic growth. Unemployment numbers jumped up. And then we jumped over to Reaganomics, which is, you know, where he did the supply side economic style. It talks about Bush. So it did an extensive history. And I know that we all know about, you know, our country's economic adventures that we have had since we've been in existence. But it basically said all of that to kind of discuss the importance of paying attention to what's going on in the economy.
And the reason for that, if I can add, the reason why paying attention to what goes on in the economy is, as much as we may or may not like it, the economy affects policy in two different ways. One, the shortage of dollars. When dollars begin to shrink, that is going to tremendously affect the policies, because then you have policies about reducing force of people that work in the buildings, or just reducing some of the core services that you have to offer. The other thing about the business cycle is, love it or not, the business communities at some points become stronger and stronger and make demands on the public school system, and those demands come in the way of policies. Think about some of the things we're having to do because the business community thinks we don't educate kids enough to prepare them for the workforce. We have a bunch of policies that relate to that. Every one of your policies that has something to do with workforce development or has to do with what we used to call vocational, every one of those policies is driven by the business cycle, what's up in business and how strong and influential they are. Sorry, Courtney.
No, you're fine. So, you know, like he said, the business cycle is basically when the business world begins to run, or their decisions kind of run our educational policy. So like he said, you'll notice like CTE and CAPE programs have become a lot more intensive. And then the profile I know like in South Carolina, we have the South profile of a South Carolina graduate, and a lot of that focuses on things more related to social skills and things of that nature versus academics. And a lot of that has to do with business cycles and what influence the business world has had on our educational policies. It talked about expansion and recession. Expansion is when things are going well, essentially. Everything's on the come up, and then recession is going to be the opposite when things are not doing well. So I had this question: how can education leaders monitor what's kind of going on in the economy? So besides what you see on the screen, are there any other things that you feel as leaders, right now, even in your position, that you could do to monitor the economic state of your local community?
Courtney, I think one way is to look at the amount of affidavits that students have signed with their parents saying that they're living with other people. I know that's a huge indicator of how the economy is in Kannapolis when you have a lot of parents living either with their parents or with friends or,
I didn't even think about that one, but I had a student that did that last year when I was in Charlotte. She was telling me she was going through the process of signing off so that she could live on her own. And that it didn't have anything to do with her parents living, they just weren't getting along. So that also kind of goes with that as well.
That's interesting. I would add, like Josh mentioned, the number of kids who are homeless. That's a good indication because I know in Caldwell County, in my last couple of years there, when the factories were leaving, the businesses were closing, like the furniture companies were leaving Caldwell County, our population decreased, but the number of people who had to leave and live somewhere else or who were kicked out because they couldn't pay for their homes because they didn't have jobs. So your homeless numbers, your McKinsey-Vento numbers would be an indicator of the business economy too. Right. And all of our economies, except for maybe some of the big cities, have suffered with the economy terribly.
I'm going out on a limb, but would crime be something you would look at in relative to business?
Crime rate.
Can I answer, Courtney? Why you think? Can I answer?
Yes.
All right. I do think it could have an impact because people who have an option to move into a community are not going to move there if it's a high crime rate. People who don't have an option will be there. But as far as getting some of those businesses that will relocate into your county, which brings people, I do think it's probably not the one you first think of, but I do think it has an impact. You disagree, Courtney?
No, sir.
All right.
I think in addition to that, I think something else to probably consider would be having connections with like support agencies in the community, like maybe Cooperative Christian Ministries or other agencies like that provide assistance to people. Mm-hmm. You had contact with them, you could see if there was an increase in the demand for food or housing subsidies and things like that. And then another thing that perhaps maybe you could monitor is like sale of real estate, or that goes along with what Josh was saying. Mm-hmm. If new home sales or whatever is going down, that might impact. But also I know that with our school, we had property that was recently acquired, and they became tax exempt properties. So I think monitoring things like that could also tell you might eventually be happening in your school district.
Right.
I want to add on to Lenore's, one of the things, because we have 6 elementary schools and we're all Title I, but we do not receive our funding by way of free and reduced lunch forms. We have a grant, which is community eligible. Anyway, it's long, but it's CEP, which is federal funded, but our percentage of that went down drastically when we, as it compared to free and reduced lunch, because our families were going and receiving faith-based assistance, pantries, food pantries versus like TANF, like food stamps and things like that. So they weren't getting counted in that percentage. Therefore, we are receiving less funding. But I think that is they're in their transient family, so they're not staying long enough to go to like your social services and apply for food stamps because they don't stay long enough, but they're getting their support. So we're able to kind of numbers aren't good for us, but we were able to figure out what was happening, if that makes sense.
Gotcha. Yeah, in regards to that and kind of the homelessness situation in the district I currently work for, there was just an issue with carbon monoxide poisoning in one of the Section 8 housing, and some people died. And so we have about 140 students that are currently displaced. And so things like that also have an effect.
And you don't want to lose them.
Right.
No, you don't.
So, okay.
Good job.
So some long-term effects that it talked about was slow growth, how it just takes a while to, regain from a recession or any fall in economics, from manufacturing to service and information, globalization, heavy debt, as far as a country-wise, inflation, and then the growing gap that is continuing to grow between the rich at the top and the poor at the bottom. So these long-term effects we also need to keep an eye on, even in our local communities, to make sure that we're preparing policies, that are going to be able to be sustained for the long term or the long haul. And then towards the end, these three sections I found to be quite interesting. It says, how does the business cycle affect spending on education? A lot of this, a lot of the things were discussed earlier, but there were three sections in the chapter: do more with less, do a lot more with a little more, and do a lot more with a lot less. Does anybody want to speak to how those phrases answers that question? Like, how does the business cycle, recessions or expansions, local economy affect how money is spent on education? So like our local districts, based on those three phrases.
Let me raise your hand if your district is operating on the last one. Yeah, they are. Anyone else? Sorry.
No. So with that point, do a lot more with a lot less. We are asking teachers and school level administrations to do a lot of things with no money, no extra stipends, no extra payment, and in a lot of cases, not a lot of resources either. It mentioned in there how sometimes policies can be snuck in to where we can remove the number of teachers that we have without adding, an additional receptionist or things like that. And so there's a lot of things that teachers are having to do now that aren't really things that they should be focused on. And so that one, I think, kind of really hits home with a lot of our districts right now.
Courtney, not to interrupt, but and I'm jumping ahead a bit, but in my chapter it talks specifically about that being one of the major things that a superintendent has to deal with in his job is the fact that you have to enforce mandates without any funding.
Right.
We continue to enforce so.
And then, everybody's expected to comply. So you have to figure out how to make it work. And then these are some additional opinions. Again, the chapter was a little scattered, but these are some additional opinions that I thought were interesting because it started talking about funding and, how money's not the answer to everything. And I think we've had some discussions in some of our previous classes about that. But there was a quote that says, money doesn't cure school problems. And there was one that it says there's no consistent relationship between, the amount of resources a school or a district is given to student performance. And I know for sure that we've had that discussion before when we talked about equity versus equality. I think that was with Dr. Bowles' class. And then instead of focusing on money, start focusing on changing the structure to in turn change the problems. And that's kind of where the school choice came in, started talking about competition, and how like even if we don't have a lot of money, we don't have a lot of resources, um, school choice options and enhancing your programs that you have to kind of be competitive and get people to come in, that's more where the focus should be. And I know that that debate can be, you know, long. The demographics, I won't belabor that point because we kind of already talked about it. But the study of demography is just, you know, the characteristics. So ethics, religion, race, socioeconomic status, all of those things make up the demographics of an area. And we know that that does have an effect on policy. As Dr. Stone already talked about, the population is changing in all of our areas in the United States as a whole. We are seeing an increase in the number of Hispanic students and population. And in a lot of our districts, we have very strong English language learner programs because of this, and that's having to shift, you know, what teaching is like. And teachers now have to kind of understand different cultures, and they have to be able to communicate with the parents and students and read L plans and additions to IEPs and things of that nature. And so those changes are affecting policies that are having to be put in place to take care of those students that we have coming in our schools. And so what are the implications of these demographic changes for education policy? It talks about, you know, does one general set of standards, is that going to work as we continue to become more diverse? Do we need to have more diverse standards and curriculum that, you know, addresses the needs and culture of the students that we serve? Do we need more resources to make those types of things work? Those are just kind of some of the things that the chapter discussed. And then, you know, just the final points, it just talks about how it takes a while to bounce back from recessions and pitfalls, but we need to make times, and even though it becomes more difficult, we need to make sure that we are paying attention to everything that's going on in our economy locally, you know, nationally, and then we also need to make sure that we are serving the demographics of students that we have. Does anyone have any questions?
All right. Great job, Courtney.
Thank you.
Now, if you will stop sharing,
Okay.
that will turn it back over to me. All right. Now, what I'd like to suggest is that we take like a 2 or 3 minute break, and then we'll come back. And Annie, I'll share the screen with you. Take about a 3 minute break to get something to drink or a bathroom break, or we'll be back. 3 minutes.
Dr. Stone.
Yes.
Shantae sent a message and she said that she's not going to make it because she's in traffic. So she said that she will, I guess, reach out to you about voicing over her presentation.
Okay. Thank you. Does she travel from Charlotte or someplace back to Georgia? Is she still commuting?
No, she lives in Georgia. I think the traffic is just bad in Atlanta.
Oh, she's in Atlanta. Yeah, I imagine it is. Whew. All right, Annie, you're up.
All right.
This is my favorite chapter, Annie. I love this chapter.
Maybe that's why I said that I did like this book. It's not going to lie, it was hard to read, but I am fascinated with the implications that this can have. So my chapter was, or chapter 4 was the political system and political culture, and it, hang on, I may have to, let's see, there we go. So Courtney, her chapter 3 was on the economics, the economy, and how demographics can really impact policy. And this chapter focused on and really related it to the importance of the less obvious, which is the structure of our political system, national, statewide, local, the political culture that, and it just explore how these factors can impact our educational systems and policies. So we're going to start out with the political system. The chapter basically divided itself into halves and focused on the political system, the structure, the history of it, and how that can affect policy and how we can view it through an educational lens, and then it switches to political culture. So our political system, this was enlightening for me. It's never a bad thing to go back and just revisit. How do we define federalism? Basically, this is when several governments, which is our state, share power among themselves and the national government cannot abolish. In the United States, historically, the states founded the national government, and the Constitution clearly delineates the sovereign powers that belong to the states and which belong to the federal government. As it evolved is where we began to see it impacting education. For decades before the Great Depression, the amount of power appropriate for the federal government was a central issue in national politics. But once we hit the 30s with the Great Depression and World War II, it led to an enormous increase in federal power just because the local and the state levels could not sustain it. It was very fragmented and broken. Then you had Carter, who, if I recall, he is the one that established the educational systems at the federal level, still continuing to give it that federal power. But then under Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, that's when he initiated new federalism, and it began to give a shift in the balance, basically giving states more power. And then, if I recall the date, I believe in 1983, you had The Nation at Risk that was published and shared. And again, that was when we were very competitive with Russia and the Sputnik launch. And we felt, or the author felt, that the nation was in a crisis, which that can be an arguable point. And where are we now? We still heed certainly to federal requirements when receiving funding. Under, I believe, Bush, it was the No Child Left Behind. Now that has been transitioned to the Every Student Succeeds Act. And then also federal funding programs. Certainly you are tied to all kinds of restrictions and requirements in order to receive that funding. And I just put Title I because that's a big one in our district, along with 2, 3, 4, and so forth. But when I do those plans, especially for Title I, everything that we say we're going to do, it's tied to funding, but yet they come and monitor. I usually get a desk monitor every 2 years and a big full audit every 4 to 5. But also state governments are playing more of an active role than ever in outlining education. For instance, for those of you in elementary, you've got the Read to Achieve Act, and then our superintendent, Mark Johnson, has outlined less testing through surveys and so forth. So we still have state and federal influence in our political system. So that was history of federalism. Let me get, if I can go to. Then the chapter really emphasized the separation of governmental powers. And because we're based on that, I bet there were, a good deal of it lended itself to the greatest challenge in developing educational policy is bridging those differences of opinion. When you have, especially at the federal level, 3 government branches and then down to the state and the local, once you start separating those powers, trying to bridge political viewpoints, backgrounds, ideology, it really can frustrate when you're trying to come to a consensus. Zooming on down to the local level, and this is where we probably see the most daily impact, is fragmentation of your local governments, where you have the counties, the municipalities, towns, townships. This is what I thought was interesting. I don't have it written down, but I believe it said 8% or only 8% of school districts are fully dependent. North Carolina is one of the states. All school districts are dependent. Fiscal dependence is especially common in the South. I did not see anything about South Carolina. So I don't know, Dr. Stone, if you can speak to that. But basically, when you are fully dependent, it encourages school districts to have common allies among local government.
All right. So the question to our South Carolina colleagues, and this is really talking about whether or not you have the power to raise money for your district. South Carolina, weigh in on it.
You know what? Do we have any South Carolina people? I don't think we do.
I just changed to South Carolina.
Yeah, Courtney.
But
that's right, Courtney. I'm sorry.
I don't know the answer to that question.
The answer is yes. South Carolina has something called a mill rate. And that is a rate in which the local school system can increase taxes. So they are not totally, they're still dependent upon the county commissioners, but they also have a little bit of taxing authority. We in North Carolina do not.
So I think in my next slide is going to get into so when we are fully dependent on the local government and then higher up the state, how does that impact us? So this is implications of the political system for school leaders. For one, as a school leader, acknowledge the resources and the power. Who has it? Where is it? Identifying those up front and making yourself very in tune with their belief systems, what they're all about, how they can help or not help. Identify and monitor competitors. I believe on page 75, it listed just a plethora of competitors, whether it be city governments, the fire department, and especially if you're going in and doing a grant or wanting to ask for money, do you have someone else that's competing for that same pot of money, or that may, whether it's overtly or covertly, undermine what you are trying to do in your district?
And probably, Annie, the biggest one that affects us in North Carolina is if your county is a host of a community college. Because when you, as a superintendent, go to the county commissioners and present your budget, the community college is also presenting theirs. And so that's probably the one that we compete the most with, the community college.
I didn't know, and one thing I wanted to ask, and even my Kannapolis colleagues, because we are a city school district, we sit on the fence of 2 counties, Rowan and Cabarrus, so we always feel like we're in competition with those counties because their growth rate, we're kind of landlocked. their growth rate is such that it just never quite seems even. But is that truly a competitor, or there's not a whole lot we can do about it?
Well, I would imagine in a unique situation like that, yes, they both are competitors.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is because both those counties probably have a little bit of a resentment. Because,
They do. Yeah.
yeah, you're definitely in competition there.
They even mentioned, other school districts, public hospitals, libraries, but so forth. So I think the main thing I took away from this is as a school leader, it is our responsibility to be aware of who holds the resources and the power, identifying, monitoring, and then most of all, using it to our advantage, networking and building relationships so they are seen or viewed as an ally versus an adversary. So that was the political system. Again, some of it's, I didn't find it being very gray. It is what it is when it's law, but it can have nuances that can impact beliefs and funding. Then it shifts to political culture, this is what I really liked. We all know that culture is a collective way of thinking about politics, including beliefs about political processes and proper goals and so forth. But it's certainly not the same as a political system. So even if two groups of people have political systems that are identical, say in Kannapolis City, they're going to play the game differently within those identical structures if their cultures differ. So also if, culture had a lot to do with geographics, where you are in regions. And as I go through the next couple of slides, think in terms of, have you ever moved from, do we have anybody living in the South that started their career up north or out west, and perhaps ideologies and belief systems are just a little different in the South compared to what you're used to. So in the U.S., there are 3 identified political cultures. The first one is traditionalistic, and that is considered us, the South, very dominant in the South. Characteristics, government is seen as positive, but it's who has the money. If in the South, do established elite, are they the ones that are providing the political leadership? In the traditionalistic culture, we're very resistant to change, which, as it reads in the book, it has somewhat perpetuated racism, and the elitism can even discourage political participation, especially in voting. I'm often wonder, did we see a little bit of that in 2016?
2018.
With some of the voting polls and, not encouraging them or even shutting down some of the polls because we were resistant to change and new candidates coming forth. So I do think we got a taste of that.
And think of this as the good old boy system. This
Yes.
is purely good old boy.
Yeah. And I think it like family ties that are just rich years and years and years of, if you don't belong to that family or that elite social circle, you probably are out of luck. Moralistic, that is the second culture that they focused on. It is dominant in the New England area. And also, I just will reference, if you're looking to see where a state falls, I believe it's page 82. So I think some of those cross over, but it was a nice outline to see where each state falls. But this is basically, you're for the common good. Everybody is in search for good society, public service. It's your civil duty, clean government. And I think where we perhaps get a bad rap, if you're in the moralistic culture, is that the other two perceive this group as being too idealistic and out of touch with reality of political or practical policies. And lastly, individualistic, developed in the mid-Atlantic states and spread westward, but there's some southern New England states, I believe Connecticut was one of them, that identifies this government as utilitarian, basically economics. A lot of exchange and favors here. Individuals that enter politics are doing it to advance themselves socially and financially, vulnerable to criticism, that it's practitioners that have no principles and everything is for sale to the highest bidder. So it's just a leg up. It reminded me more so, I think individualistic and traditionalistic are very much aligned more than moralistic. So what does this mean for us? That's all well and good, but as a school leader, so the next three areas are just like questions to ask yourself to figure out, like traditionalistic. I mean, that's probably what we are experiencing here in the South with all of your LEAs, but I liked how the book gave questions that if you're answering yes to two or more, that's where you need to zoom in and like, so now what? Now that I know that political participation is viewed as a privilege for the elite view, how am I going to navigate that as a leader? Do most political leaders belong to that elite group of kinship, social ties? Do I want to be a part of it? Do I need to be a part of it? So those are just questions through all three that really help you zoom in to say yes, yes, and yes. So now what? But I would like to stop here and ask the group, how does political culture, or how do you view it impacting your district at this point? Or do you see any evidence of that? So we're in the South. Do you see government being run by an elite few? Do you feel like there's a gap between political leaders and the folks that are actually in the educational setting? Is government viewed negatively, or do you feel that maybe you live in the South but you identify with one of the other two?
Well, I definitely think that though I live in the South, I don't identify with the traditionalistic setting. And I do believe that there is a gap between those in charge and education. I think it's pretty obvious in North Carolina.
Oh, very obvious. Have you, in your county commissioners, do you, and again, when you become a superintendent or assistant superintendent, you're going to have a lot of interaction with your county commissioners and your county manager. And a real telling thing in a traditionalist setting, which most North Carolina counties do fall under, is the same old people on the county commissioners. I mean, do you have a man that's been on the county commissioners that's been there 20 years? Do you have someone of same family that tends to be the ones who own all the property? Are they the ones on the county commissioners? So it's really this attitude of there's a select group of people who are born to be the leaders. And they're going to be it forever and a day. And they are not necessarily there for, for someone who owns a lot of land who may be on the county commissioners, it is not in their interest to raise taxes to help pay for schools because they pay more taxes on their land. So a very clear Southern trait.
Any others? I think perhaps most educators or just colleagues of mine, you're right, Lenore, we may live in this setting, but we don't identify. I think a lot of us identify more from the moralistic. We want it to do well. Other thoughts?
Annie, I don't know how if this specifically relates to that, but over the weekend I had a pretty interesting conversation with someone who, a close friend who disagrees with me on the political spectrum 100%, but I was talking about how I believe that the current party in control of our General Assembly is making decisions based on education, but there's a lot of political force behind it. And he reminded me that, imagine if you were on that side for the countless years that the Democrats were in charge of the state General Assembly, and how, I just think, I think we talked about this earlier, and it's one of my discussions. I think that, politics is so embedded in everything that we do. The majority of educators, used to fall in one, party, or or align themselves with one particular party, and that that's changing. I just think that the culture of politics it affects every aspect of policy. I don't know if that really.
No, I agree. I find that where we are, it seems like if someone gets, like, even in our board's ear, how quickly it can lead to a policy change, and it seemed to originate from perhaps one or two really vocal people, not the silent majority. And I often wonder, is that's happening in Raleigh in exchange for political favors and funding and long-term, I pat your back, you pat mine. I don't know, Dr. Stone, if that's,
Oh, yeah.
It just makes me so sad that that's happening when perhaps students are not the anchor of the conversation. It's what looks good on paper and how can it advance me and my personal agenda. So,
all right. So you asked me to get on my soapbox, so I'm gonna.
Please do.
If you look at the number of people in Raleigh who have gone on trips to Florida, all expense paid trips to visit Florida and how they do things in Florida, and then they come back and they try to implement those in North Carolina. I'm talking about school vouchers. I'm talking about opportunity scholarships. All of that stuff is there not because our General Assembly members really, really believe they're going to make a big difference. They're there because I believe that someone with deep pockets is giving them money to help them drive policy this way. And that's the ugliness of politics. If you've got big money, you can overcome the common sense of, your money is worth more than the common collective sense of people. Most people in North Carolina do not want their tax dollars going to support private schools and vouchers because they know that's pulling money out of their public schools. But yet, it's a big movement, and every year in North Carolina, they're adding $10 million more to opportunity scholarships. But looking at it at the national level, how many of you, raise your hand, really do believe that Betsy DuBose is the most qualified Secretary of Education we've ever had? The woman is an idiot. She got the job because of her money.
Yep.
That is all she got it for, and because of that, we are now seeing a push towards school choice. We're seeing a movement away from reporting sexual assaults, reporting, even your civil rights, the cases that normally go to civil rights, the Office of Civil Rights, which I'm not a big fan of because I've had to send in these reports, but she could care less. And that's the move, that's the policies that are coming out of the federal government now. They're not driven on what's best for kids, for female students not to be sexually harassed in colleges or schools. They're not the best for minority kids who are suffering real cases of civil discrimination. It's all about who has the dollars. And unfortunately, we're moving more and more to that. And, if anyone out there really believes that Betsy DuBose knows anything about public schools, you should have watched her hearing when she was confirmed. The woman's an idiot. She's just a rich idiot. That's how you get it.
But she shoots bears. I remember that.
Shouldn't even understand what exceptional children is. But anyway, the answer to your question is, and I think Josh said this correctly, politics plays all politics. And that's why this chapter is about the political culture, because we can't escape it. And like you said, Annie, somebody bends the ear of the General Assembly member about how we need to have teacher assistants do less in the classroom. It becomes a policy. So politics, if we don't keep an eye on it, and we don't keep an eye on our politicians, and we drop the ball like we did in 2016, then we are really we are really hurting ourselves. No one ever thought that Betsy DuBose would dismantle the civil rights reporting for the Office of Education. No one ever thought she would make it where private vendors can now take advantage of military vets to go to these private colleges and get absolutely nothing out of it. I mean, who don't have any recourse. So politics is important. Pay attention to it locally, state, and nationally. And you don't have to look too far from Raleigh to see what bad politics does here in North Carolina. That's my stand, and I'm gonna stick to it.
I think a lot of people are standing with you on that one.
Oh, good.
So I believe that was, so we started out with the political structure and the system itself, and how as leaders we need to be aware of the structures and competitors, and then it went into culture. So I believe that wraps it up. What questions do you have?
Annie, give us some real quick takeaways about policy from that particular chapter. What are your major takeaways about the political system and the political culture, and how it affects your job as in your district?
Well, for one, I think we see a lot of the elitism on our board. Same social circles. So personally, I see a lot of policy being driven by a select few. Takeaways for the whole group, I think it's just how impactful. As the first slide shared, it's the lesser known, and sometimes we don't even realize how influential it can be before it just gets away from us. You think economy, money, and demographics really shapes and molds their decisions. And from this chapter, it screamed out loud that you need to have your eye on the ball as a leader, network, build relationships, know whether they think they're in charge or they really are in charge. You can't just sit back and wait on someone to knock your door, because it's knock on the door. It's very competitive. But then I liked how it divided it into the three different divisions or fractions of factions of culture, so that you can zoom in to see, is this really what I'm seeing in my area? Like Lenore said, she lives in the South but doesn't really identify that way, but is that what she's facing when she's trying to make decisions or impact on her end? So I think just not being naive about how impactful those two components can be when shaping policy is the takeaway.
All right, good job. Any questions for Annie? All right, Annie, if you will stop sharing, and Daryl, I think you're up.
Okay.
And Daryl, I think if you will, there you go. You guys are onto this. You know this stuff well. And here I was thinking Blackboard may have been fairly, or parts of it may have been fairly, I'm so underestimating you. It's yours, Daryl.
All right, I'm a little under the weather tonight, but we'll go ahead and move forward. So first off, my chapter was on chapter 5. It deals with values and ideology. And in this chapter, focus questions, we're going to focus on what values shape education policy. How do these values relate to the major U.S. political ideologies? How can education leaders identify the values and ideological positions behind policies and policy proposals? And in an increasingly ideological policy environment, how can education leaders act both effectively and democratically? So we're going to start off first with the importance of ideas. So school leaders must have a general understanding of the political ideas that swirl around them in order to think intelligently about educational policy. You got to know what political ideas are out there, right? Because ideas operate as the approximate driving force in American politics, right? The book talked about how in the past we were viewed as more ideological, and now we're less ideological. So now, with that being said, we're looking at why ideas are important, and there are two major reasons that the book pointed out. Ideas, beliefs, and values, they shape the way people define policy. They constrain people's ability to perceive possible solutions to policy problems. And also, in thinking about educational policy, therefore, school leaders must ask questions. And these questions are centered around the following. What values lead to propose this policy when you're thinking about it and you're thinking about those ideals? Are there any value conflicts inherent in it? What assumptions about society, government, and economics lie behind policy? And with what broader ideological position is this policy consistent? So these are some questions that educational leaders need to think about in terms of policy with having ideological things on their mind. So moving on, basic values in politics. Self-interest values, there are two major ones, self-interest values. This breaks down into economic and power. And when we're looking at economics, who benefits economically from the policy? This is what you want to think about as a leader, as a district leader, when you're forming policies and you're thinking about policies. And there's a figure, 5.1, within those pages that kind of give you things that you can look at to kind of guide your thinking around that. Also, power, who gains power as a result of this policy? We kind of talk about those influencers. We talk about, we talk about those that have power within the community. Is it benefiting them or is it benefiting the kids? So these are things that you want to think about holistically in a district. General social values. So we want to bring those into consideration as well when we talk about order. Order is around the broader social problems that spill over into schools. And an example that was given in the book was bullying, right? When we have a lot of, parents, who are speaking out against bullying, and it's a problem that's becoming more prevalent in society. And we have to think about policies that can counteract bullying. And that's just an example of a social value that can spill over into the school. Individualism, we all know that, and in the book it says individualism is at the core of American culture. Everybody is in it for themselves pretty much, right? Their own gain, their own self-interest. And these are just some basic views in American politics. We see that with the wall that's being requested. Also, to talk about democratic values. Democratic values include some things that we are aware of, like liberty. Like liberty includes freedom, independence, or choice. And there's some things that guide your thinking on that in figure 5.3. Equality. Our Constitution speaks on all men are created equal. So that's a value of democracy. And also fraternity, right? Brotherhood, social interactions in small groups and what these small groups are geared to do. We also have economic values. Economic values, these are focusing around efficiency, high levels of student learning with low expenditures. There's a figure, 5.6, that you can look at to kind of guide your thinking on that as well. Trying to get more out of people for less, pretty much. Economic growth, increasing production, stimulating domestic consumption, and expanding foreign trade. And figure 5.7 is a good reference for that. And also quality, excellence, and high standards. And these are just different values within U.S. politics. Then the book kind of talks about how values start to kind of interact with each other. Talks about cyclical shifts in dominant values. So the way people prioritize these major values. As a leader, when we're looking at policy, we have to prioritize what is valued the most, right? We can't pursue all the values at the same time, right? So what's most important, not for us, but for your district, right? Based off politics and things that are going on in society that directly impact your district, what has most priority? Right now, I would say safety and CMS. And that's something that I intend to focus on with my policy. Also, important value conflicts, the search for balance. So the chapter focuses on conflicts associated with freedom and efficiency. And when we look at the conflicts involving freedom, this is dealing with any unrestricted freedom. It pretty much compromises all other values, right? Most obvious with the value of order. We have to have order. We must have laws and social customs to set limits on human behavior, right? We have to find a balance between freedom and equality, right? If we give too much freedom, then that can create a conflict, right? That can create a conflict with other entities like quality or with equality, because we're giving too much choice, right? Then it talks about conflicts involving efficiency. And this is an excerpt I pulled from the book. The attempt to keep costs low and productivity high. People, in doing this, people will receive economic rewards in proportion to how hard they work. And as a result of this, if we were to take this approach, this will result in inequality, because we know everybody doesn't work at the same level.
Some people can't work at the same level. The part of inequality here too, I agree with you, Daryl, is that it does create the inequality, but then again, this is assuming that everybody's coming to the table with the same, everything's the same values, the same abilities, and reality is, by no fault of their own, a lot of people don't have the same as everyone else. And this is where inequality become untenable.
And then the book kind of goes on to kind of define ideology. And basically, it's a simplistic set of ideas, right? A number of ideas to kind of work together, create that ideology. And it breaks down major U.S. ideologies, right? And it divides them into two major houses. We have the house of conservatism and liberalism. Too far. All right, so with conservatism, there's three different types that it was kind of talking about. Business conservatism. So with that type, that group is motivated almost entirely by self-interest, and they look to kind of transform schools, and they're in favor of policies that create a competitive market, right? So we're thinking about charter schools. We're thinking about vouchers, things of that nature. Some of those things that Betsy DeVoe are in favor of. Then we have religious conservatism, which supports school choice and parents' rights.
And homeschool.
And homeschool, yes, sir. And they're strictly against secular humanism. So anything dealing, we know what secular humanism is, something that's not dealing with religious factions. Then we also have the Tea Party movement, and this one was a new one to me, but they're suspicious of all elites, and they favor less government and lower taxes.
Oh, if you haven't been a Tea Party person, Daryl, you haven't lived. These people are crazy.
And then we start to break down liberalism, ideologically of the modern Democratic Party. There were two different components here: New Democrats and Progressive Democrats. So New Democrats, they consider policies poorly adapted to the problems of today. Some of those problems consist of equality issues that we have across the board. And we have Progressive Democrats who value equality and solidarity with poor and minority groups. So they really focus.
Can I interrupt, Daryl? All right. So you all kind of think of, I'm gonna throw out a name, and you think of where a politician, and you tell me where they fall under this. And this is current politicians. All right. Let's start with the obvious. Donald Trump. None.
Business
conservatism.
No, he's not. Yeah, that's probably the closest. A business. That's probably the closest, because he's not religious. He's not into the Tea Party movement. All right, very good. All right, let's talk about Hillary Clinton.
Progressive Democrat.
Anyone else? Hillary Clinton.
I would say Tea Party movement.
No.
I would say New Democrat.
I would say, it could be either one of them, but I think she's probably considered one of the old class Democrats, and they're not progressive as much as more. They are issues. This is a hard one to describe between the New Democrats and the Progressive Democrats. Somebody give me an example of probably one of the most in the news progressive Democrats right now, or who ran.
Bernie Sanders.
Bernie Sanders is the Progressive Democrat. He's all about national health, everything.
Or who's the Kamala Harris? Would she be considered because wanting health care for all?
Yeah,
And
that's progressive.
Elizabeth Warren.
I would say it's progressive. Now, the difference, this one's a harder one than the conservatism because they really do stand out. But the New Democrats are what we consider as the mainstream Democrat. They're the ones who they're still liberal, but they don't go quite out to the socialist level yet, because I think of the progressive Democrats, and not being the socialist is bad, but they're the ones with these kind of out of the box ideas of national health, college, free college education for everybody. So think of them as sort of the little bit outside of what we would call extreme, even though you may not consider them extreme, because I don't, but a lot of people do consider them kind of the ones who are pushing the Democrats. And that's the problem the Democrats are going to have in this coming election, is the Democratic Party is really fighting within itself of these Democrats and the progressives. And the progressives are really the ones who are winning elections. And whereas the Republican Party, which is eat up with conservatism, they are having a tremendous amount of problems between their three groups.
so what are your thoughts on, I think the Starbucks CEO, the centrist, that he's not identifying? Does he just need to go away?
He does. He's liberalism. He is liberalism, and he's probably going to hurt the Democrats.
Yeah.
Sorry, Daryl, we got off task. Go ahead.
Oh, you're all right. So then the book kind of breaks down some
You're kind of freezing on us,
some
Daryl.
other ideologies. You say what? Can you hear me?
Freezing on us, but go ahead.
Okay. We have extremist ideologies in the U.S. We have left-wing extremism and right-wing extremism. We also have ideologies in other countries, such as social democracy and Christian democracy. And then breaking everything back down to us as leaders, dealing effectively with ideological conflicts. What we have to do as leaders, we have to assess our own ideological stance. We have to have some type of prevention measure, an ounce of prevention measure, pretty much ensuring policies about curriculum, religion, making sure those policies are clear and consistent with current legal opinion. We need to recognize ideological conflict, be able to acknowledge that and be able to work through that, obtaining information about an ideological issue. And we have to open the democratic process, right? So we have to be more democratic as leaders when we're thinking about policy and thinking about the different ideals, so that we're bringing more perspectives into play. And what I want to do is kind of ask you guys, I wanted to use the notice and wonder strategy here. So pretty much give me one thing that you notice about the relationship between ideology and policy, and give me one thing you still wonder about the relationship between ideology and policy. That's a tough word for me to say.
You know, Daryl, I've never seen it quoted. I've never seen it use this format, noticed and wondered. I like that. I may borrow it.
So the relationship between ideology and policy are definitely closely related. They might even be one and the same because it really does influence policy. Whoever is in charge, your policies, you have a voice. What do I wonder? I wonder if it will ever change. I wonder if the system will ever change, and if we'll ever have the opportunity for equality, for equity.
Good. Very good.
What would prevent it from changing? What do you think? And it's open to anybody. What do you think would prevent it from changing?
Well, I think both of those things, ideologies that form policies, prohibit, progressive change. And I agree with Lenore that I think that they are one and the same. I know that's strong to say, but like she said, whatever the ideology of that person that's in charge of those group of people, they're going to push that policy, or they're going to, veto the policy. And so that has a big impact on, that particular district. And then my wonder is, if it's going to change, like, where do you even start?
Can I add one thing? I think to Lenore and Courtney's point, I think we're in such a nasty place right now between ideology and policy that, we demonize the other side, and I'm really bad about it, and I apologize to you all for coming out of that sometimes. But it is so bad now that something's going to happen, and I hate to say, but think about what happened after 9/11, when the country kind of forgot about Democrat, Republican, forgot about conservative, liberal, and kind of came together. And I don't want ever for something like that to happen, but it's going to take a big shocker to the system for us to, I think, ever even get better, much less, I think we'll continue to get worse because, I've tried to have conversations with people who don't think like me. And I know I zone out when they try to convince me, and I know they zone out, and it's just a kind of and as long as we're doing that, it's not going to get any better. But it can, but it's just going to take a lot of effort.
I agree. I mean, no one's interested in the art of debate or taking the proper channels. And we dealt with that here at school today. I mean, we're trying to enforce our dress code, and it's a policy. And the parent complaints are just, if you don't give me what I want, I'm going to go and blast you on social media. There's no time for understanding. I think so. That's the social media effect. No one knows how to communicate and agree anymore. It's just we hide behind being able to blast a nasty email or post something on Facebook just because we're enforcing policy. So that's the unfortunate part.
That's true.
I think relevance plays a major part as well. In talking to the superintendent last week, he said, if you try to push a policy right now on safety, you probably won't get much pushback because it's very relevant right now. But if you try to push a policy on grading or curriculum or something of that nature, you may get a lot of pushback because it's a very touchy topic. And the relevance of safety right now is pretty much more of a priority. So just kind of knowing that as a leader, you can kind of direct, your policy and the creation of your policies in the right direction according to the priority of your district and relevancy.
Good example. All right, Carol, is that it?
Yes, sir.
Thank you much. Hope you feel better.
Thank you.
Josh, you're up. If you can stop sharing. Oh. Ooh, Josh is black and white.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. So I'll try to get through this quickly for the sake of time. Chapter 6 was I hate to say, not as interesting as the last two chapters. I could talk about politics all day long, but this was just more of a kind of a snapshot of who are the policy actors, who are the ones that influence and are involved and adopt and implement the policy or policies specifically in education. So
what do I call them, Josh? What do we call them in class?
Influencers.
Yeah, influencers.
Influencers, yes. Yeah. So the beginning of the chapter talks about how those actors exist on all three levels of government, but this chapter specifically focuses on state policy actors because they have the most influence on education policy itself, and that that goes back to the 10th Amendment and states having an implicit right to education. So again, just in a summary, this chapter introduces policy actors and it identifies their roles. So it doesn't go in detail about what they do. It just kind of does a lot of surface level, and there are quite a few. So please bear with me as we go through each of these. All right, so kind of breaks it into three sections, and the first that it talks about are the government actors, and then it starts with the legislative branch. And I think, Dr. Stone, you actually went over this in our first face-to-face class, so I'll briefly go over this again. There are 50 state legislators in the United States. 49 are bicameral, which means there are two houses. Nebraska is the only exception. The smaller body in the states is the Senate. Those have longer terms, and they work at a much slower pace because there's fewer people. They tend to be more experienced, more seasoned, and their debate is longer. The larger body in most states is the House of Representatives. Those are mostly 2-year terms, and it's much more dynamic, much more partisan, much more controversial. And that's actually a reflection, I think, of our federal government today. Use that as an example. Our Senate's kind of slow, and a lot of people that probably should retire. In the House of Representatives, again, it's much more dynamic and sometimes more reflective of our populations. State legislators do not typically don't resemble their constituents demographically. Still, the overwhelming majority of politicians are white males. Although that is changing, Dr. Stone talked about that, and even in the most recent election, even in our state, the General Assembly, that is changing, which is a good thing, in my opinion. So a major function is the development and passage of statutes, and most of this work is completed in various committees who form the policy and the statutes, and there are members from both parties. But the majority party has more members, and whoever is the majority party really has the influence of what the policy or the statute that's being passed. And I think you can see that in our General Assembly's recent history. When the Democrats were in control, the policy was taking a completely different direction as to now. When the Republicans for so long had a supermajority, their direction was a bit different. But I did read something today that today was the first big session of our General Assembly, and that there was hope that because there is no longer a supermajority, there's more likely a bipartisan approach to a lot of our bills, which I think is a little bit uplifting for the direction of our state. So it did go into detail about how the legislative branch is the most influential actor of all educational policy at the state level. And then it specifically breaks down the staff. So the legislative staff has increasingly become more important over time. This was new to me, that I think it said, and I don't have it, but by the 1960s or 70s, there really wasn't any such thing as a staff, maybe a secretary, but with federalism or new federalism and Reagan and putting more responsibility with the states, legislators started adding more people to help them do their jobs. So now there's 3 big types of legislative staff. The first is the clerical staff. Those perform common office duties. But it talked about how they have even though they are sometimes the ones that are not educated the most and they're paid the least, they still have quite a bit of power because they oversee legislators' schedules. So if they don't like someone, they could, just keep them off the schedule. So I thought that was interesting that they have that power when they're overseeing the schedules.
And think of the power that your school secretary has.
Oh, yeah.
You may not have that master's degree, but she's awesome power.
Right. Okay, so then the professional staff, they screen and filter all material that reaches the legislative office. They do routine casework with constituents, letters, phone calls, working with mayors, things like that. They review and analyze budgets and major issues. And obviously their influence is pretty self-explanatory because they are, in a lot of ways, the minds of legislators. And a lot of the information that they're feeding their legislator is biased to what their belief is. So again, they have quite a bit of influence. And then you have a centralized staff agency that is supposed to be more neutral. They help legislators draft sample bills. They research legal questions. But again, I think the book even talked about this chapter talked about that in policy, there's really no such thing as being neutral. You're always going to have that bias. And anytime you have the ability to help guide people, you typically will guide them to the direction of your bias.
Josh, can I add one thing here? In
Or
North
please.
Carolina, we have all three types of legislative staff. But if I am just a normal General Assembly member, I've got one person who's my clerical staff. She or he is my gatekeeper, my secretary, my appointment calendar person. So all General Assembly members have that. If you are in leadership, you have the professional staff, such as the Speaker of the House and the Senate President. They have a professional staff. They have an education consultant. They have probably one or two other areas that they have someone who's professional that looks after all policies about education. And then our state also has this centralized staff. They're the ones who work for the General Assembly, not the General Assembly member. They're the ones who go back and write the bills, research, and they're the lawyers, pretty much, that are on staff for the General Assembly.
So then it moves into the executive branch, and it talks about governors of the states and how that has almost equal, or if not equal, influence to legislators regarding policy development. The governor appoints state officials, considerable control over the state budget, can veto legislation, and can act as an issue catalyst in state policy making. And so one of the things that it talked about is education is increasingly becoming an issue most governors emphasize. And I would agree with that, but I think that the types of education that they're emphasizing are dependent upon their beliefs. Then you have the state boards of education. Those are mostly appointed by governors. Those are second only to legislatures in authority over education policy. And that is because they develop rules and regulations to enforce education legislation from the legislature. They develop requirements for teachers, monitor assessment programs, develop and regulate graduation requirements, and determine accreditation hours. And that was just requirements. That was just to name a few of the things that they do. So they have quite a bit of control.
And in North Carolina, our governor thinks he's an education governor, but has very little power because of that supermajority in the House and Senate. Our State Board of Education used to be a big, important body, but with the recent lawsuit where the state superintendent sued them, they are less so now. But they used to be extremely powerful, but not as much as they were even up to a year ago.
I remember all of that. Do you think that that's a trend in all the states, or is that just,
as soon as we get another Democrat in the State Department of Public Instruction, or as soon as, well, let me tell you why I think it changed, and I'll stop because you've got time. I think it changed because the governor appoints people to the State Board of Education, and the General Assembly in North Carolina didn't want any Democrats or people like that on it, so they changed it, and that's why. And it'll go back when we have another Democratic state superintendent. It'll go back.
Okay. All right. So just a little bit more about the executive branch. The chief state school officer, or as we know it here in North Carolina, is the superintendent of public instruction. And I think when we talked at our last face-to-face, that's the same title for South Carolina. I did put this in there because it said, I think on the second sentence under this, that most are professional educators with several years of administrative experience. I guess North Carolina is the outlier there. But they are appointed by state boards, the governor, or popularly elected, as is ours in North Carolina. And is South Carolina is popularly elected as well?
Yes. They have a good one.
Yes. So, and then their main duty is general supervision of all public schools in the state. So then you have state departments of education. So those are ranked just below the legislature for level of policy influence. They're headed by the chief of state or the school or the state superintendent. They develop rules and regulations for laws regarding education, and they provide assistance for districts with regards to compliance. All right, the judicial branch, and actually it talked about how judges can exercise a considerable amount of influence over education policy. because they do interpret state statutes and they have the power to overturn them. And then it got a little bit into some political reasons, how this can be influenced by politics, because groups or individuals can obviously advocate for judges who favor their particular cause, or spend money for court cases, which might result in an impact on something that those people are advocating for or influence. Now, Dr. Stone, I think North Carolina, correct me if I'm wrong, just passed a law saying that on ballots, we now declare whether a judge is a Democrat or Republican,
Well,
which in my opinion will change our judicial.
yes, I think it will, but I think it's going to, yes, I do think it will, because now traditionally people will vote, some people vote Republican just because they're Republican, some people vote Democrat. So I think it will have that factor. The other thing to know here too is, let me just ask this real quick question. How many of you have heard of Judge Manning? That's a perfect example of the judicial branch getting involved. That man has just done more for school finance than the General Assembly ever did. So that's a perfect example of that.
Okay. All right. So then the chapter went into local government actors, and they started with local boards of education. And then it talked about how state boards typically delegate most of their authority to local boards. However, there is an increasing trend of the states to assume more authority. And that started, a few decades ago, where they're just slowly picking up their authority and taking away from the local boards. But nevertheless, local boards develop policies suited to their specific district to ensure compliance with state policy. So they use some examples here. For example, testing. The state board will give mandates about testing, and then school boards will make those mandates or that policy fit their district while remaining in compliance. School dates, curriculum programs, things of that nature. Then it talked about superintendents. At the local level, those are chief executive officers of local school boards. Almost all are appointed by local boards. And I mentioned this earlier when Courtney was presenting. It talked about how they're usually involved in some type of crisis, and that takes up the majority of their time. And one of those biggest challenges are enforcing state mandates without funding. And then two things: the average time in office, or average time that they're serving, superintendents are serving in that position, is steadily decreasing, and that fewer educators are interested in assuming the position. And some of my questions at the end, I want to have a discussion about that, because I find that interesting. Who are the non-governmental policy actors? Spend a little bit of time talking very briefly about education interest groups. The most powerful are the teacher unions. They talk specifically about the NEA and the AFT. And then non-education interest groups. So those are groups that represent business, influential in every state capital, and that typically these non-education interest groups are on the opposing side of education advocates, because 9 times out of 10 they're siding with business, and they want lower taxes, which taxes fund public schools, so that automatically makes them, against us, so to speak. And then think tanks, they depend on foundations, corporations, and individuals for financial support. They gather data about public policy and then communicate those findings to government. Again, they're influential because what they're researching, what they're sending to government officials is obviously biased one way or another. And then the big one, the media, very influential and should never be considered neutral with regards to facts. And that was, I summarized that from the book. That's just not my personal statement. Most of their influence is with agenda setting, which issues make the short list of those addressed by policymakers. So they're always pushing what's going to get their ratings up, so to speak. So I hope I didn't bore you guys too much with that, but I did have a few questions and statements, I guess. But the one that I really wanted to talk about was describe the roles of your district superintendent, because I see, and Annie and Lenore, you can disagree with this, but I see our superintendent getting caught up in those crisis situations. And, you know, when we're in principals meetings, I think it's always, what can I take back to the state? Because we're not funded in this way. So I'm just curious if that's going on in all the other districts.
How many of you want to be superintendents? Raise your hand. Nobody? Nobody wants to be a superintendent? Why are you in the doctoral program? Oh my God, Josh, you're so right that they are just it's a perfect market for you, and they pay well. I mean, I know you have strange hours and the pressures are such, but oh my gosh, it's a perfect job. But there's a reason why fewer people are going into it, and there's a reason why the average life for a superintendent is 3.5 years. And as Josh hit on it, and as all of you know, it's because it comes at you 24/7. You are putting out fires more than you're an educator, but it's a great job. Don't let me dissuade you from it. You're in a doctoral program. Can you imagine what this will do for your last 3 years of salary and your pension when you retire from the state of North Carolina? Oh my gosh, you're missing a great opportunity. Do all your superintendents put out fires? Is that all you think they do? I know it's not all you think they do, but is that what you think they spend most of their time doing? I will tell you this, it probably varies from district to district. Now, imagine Kannapolis is probably 4,000, 5,000 people, students, probably on the smaller end of districts. Charlotte Meck, do you think Dr. Wilcox is putting out fires all the time? There's so many fires in Charlotte Meck because it's so big that he can't. But he's got a layer of people who are putting out those fires. So when it gets to him, it really truly is a huge, huge fire. And it's all about politics. It's all about the political or the PR about the situation. So in a large district, the superintendent gets to do a lot of PR. He gets to do a lot of playing nicey with all those good old boys. But in a smaller district, because you have fewer people at the central office to help you, you do put out a lot of fires. But it's a fun job. It is. I promise you it is. I wouldn't have done it for 20 years. And I was never run out of a district. Never. Always left when I wanted to leave. All right. Josh, back to you. If not, let me know when you're finished and we'll close up.
Okay, yeah, just, you know, I put this first question at who has the most influence of policy in your local districts. I thought a lot about this. I don't really know the answer in Kannapolis, who has the most influence. I feel like our policy doesn't change that often. So, you know, it talked a lot about influence. I was just wondering what the case was in Charlotte Meck or the other districts.
Josh, what about this? I think that the largest influencer of policy in Kannapolis would be perhaps our state legislators, because it seems like we are constantly trying to figure out, like, back up and punt. You know, we're always trying to figure out how to do less, to do more with less. So I perhaps think that, you know, we're always responding to outside influencers. And I think our greatest influencer is, you know, lack of funding.
Yep. The General Assembly. That's the answer for every one of your districts. Your school board, your superintendent, they only do probably 10% of the policies. It's 90% are coming by the state. So you're right. It's your General Assembly members. And I'd say that's true for every district.
And I know we've answered or we've talked about this several times tonight, but, you know, do you think there's a place for politics in educational policy? I mean, I think in a perfect world there wouldn't be, but unfortunately we live in a world where I think it's always there.
And always will be.
Yep.
All right. If you'll unshare, Josh, let me do one quick thing for you all, and then we're going to call it a night, and I will see you all later. All right. For those of you, the 4 of you who did your presentations tonight, go into course assessments. Am I sharing my screen?
No.
No. Okay. Let me go back. All right, go under course assessments here. Click down. You place this under your chapter presentation 1. That's where you put this. And when you do your second PowerPoint, you'll put it there. So this is where it goes. Just simply click on it, download it. If you want to keep it for a little while, but if it were me, I didn't see anything that needed to be changed in any of your PowerPoint presentations. I'd go ahead and do it tonight. So you can go ahead and get a grade on it. Put it right here under chapter 1. All right. Now, our next Zoom session is next week on the 30th. So we have a couple of presentations, so please have those ready. Oh, yes, Lenore.
Today is the 30th, right?
Oh, my God, yes. I am. Now you know why I thought superintendent was fun. February 13th is our next date. I'm sorry. Duh. All right. February 13th, and we have our next face-to-face coming up February 23rd, 24th. I will not be there with you for that one, but Dr. Davis will, and you'll be talking about famous or court cases. So by then, we should be in the Essex book. Any questions for the good of the group? All right, go forth and do great things. Good night. Okay.